Hello again, and welcome to episode 40, wow, of Sword of the Spirit, Sermonator. We're going to embark tonight on something that is some very intriguing information that we're going to share and go through. Some of it's a bit shocking, but I think in a good way. And we're going to go slow. We're going to take our time. We may get through it in both sessions tonight, or we may not, and we'll extend it. But it's going to be a pretty interesting teaching and study together, and more in the way like fireside chat, so that we can understand and formulate these ideas in our head about what we're seeing. So if I were you, I would get my Bible open, and we are going to focus this week on Isaiah the 14th chapter. There's some things in there that we need to really get a handle on as it points forward in time. And then we'll briefly touch on several chapters after that. Okay. Now, last we spoke when I explained the waving of the Omer in the upper room, and how the apostles had a perfect first fruit to offer, that same fruit that was burnt up with those tongues of fire, but they were waving that and saying, "Look, Lord, this is the perfect first fruit offering. There's no worms, nothing." We learned that there are two types of worms that attack the new wheat. And it's likened unto, symbolically, of the worm that infects new believers when they first are beginning to bud, and oftentimes results in a spiritual separation more than a enlightening. Well, the wheat is symbolic of that. They had the one type of worm that attacks early, and then they had the army worms that go after the wheat as it's growing in full before the harvest. Now, we're going to talk some more about worms and maggots and serpents and Satan. And we're going to learn something about all of those things. And in doing so, I think we're going to learn something about ourselves as well. I want to ask you a question. And you don't have to answer it. I'll start to answer and go through some things that will help us to understand. Why is idolatry the focus of the first commandment? Well, we've spoken before about how, I think we even said last week, and we quoted scripture, it says, and covetousness, which is the 10th commandment, which is idolatry. So it is. Any of the commandments that are broken out that are, for men in response to God or about God, when we break one, we break them all. So in breaking the last one, we break the first one. The first one is about idolatry. Thou shalt have no, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no gods before me. That means you too, me too, little g, all right? That's what was sold in the garden and some other places. And we're going to touch on so many things in this next hour or so. But we understand that first commandment, all right? You're either choosing yourself or you're choosing God. If you choose anything other than God, then you've held that up as an idol, which is idolatry, including and primarily us. The first commandment is the most important. It's the easiest to break, and it's the one that's most violated. And, oh, by the way, if you break any of the other 9, you're breaking that one too. So that's no way out. This is the moral compass, the moral code, the moral law that all men are bound by. All right? These are not independent laws for the Jewish people or nation of Israel or anything like that. These are plain and simple for everyone, corporately and severally. So that's one question that we want to think about. Then I want to ask you a real important question. Who did the Messiah come to save us from? And why? We have to really know that from everything we've studied and what we're going to learn even more tonight, the Messiah came here to save us from ourselves. That's it. He's not saving us from the hand of the enemy, Hasatan, the devil who goes about looking and seeking whom he may devour. Important point. Fact. But we're going to learn a few things and why. So then we say that the Messiah came to save us from ourselves. Well, why? You know, it's fine that we say it, we accept it, we understand it, but we have to understand why. There's nothing in conversation and communication that means anything. You can sit and jabber all day about what you believe. I believe this, you believe, I believe, without getting to why. There's no understanding. There's no narrowing of the gap. The gap either remains or it widens. So, in explaining, we're going to talk about why. Why would the Messiah come here to save us from ourselves? Well, let's take a look at a couple of other scriptures that will help us get a little handle on this. In Jeremiah, the 17th chapter, okay, verse 9, listen to what it says. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Pretty powerful statement. We see something very similar in Genesis, the very beginning, first book of the Bible. We look in Genesis, the 6th chapter, and maybe I should have read that one first, but you know what? Everything works the way it's supposed to. So we look in Genesis, the 6th chapter. And, excuse my fat fingered here. It's sometimes tough to get the pages over. Okay. Go into chapter 6, and we're going to look at verse 5. And here we are. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. He goes on to say how the ungodly will ultimately be destroyed. I will destroy man whom I've created from the face of the earth, man and beast and creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them to begin with. All right? But we know that God's justice is always going to be served. Now we take a look all the way over in the New Covenant, and we look in Matthew chapter 15. Okay? The first gospel. Matthew chapter 15, verse 19. I'll read it to you. For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. And these are the things that defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands doesn't defile a man. At this point, he was basically pointing out that what is the issue of the heart and the intent. Just like in any crime that's committed, there has to be intent proven. He says, so if you're worried about, eating with dirty hands, this, that, and the third, that's not going to save you. That's not going to help you. And that's not the point of what we're talking about here. We're talking about the heart of man. And he basically rattles off a number of commandments. The 5th one, the 6th one, the 8th one, the 7th one, and basically the first 2. But he says the heart of man is evil. And I think we just saw how he feels about that. And if we look in Mark, let's look in Mark. This is also an interesting section on this issue. In the 7th chapter of Mark. And I read these because not to be repetitive, but to show you the consistency of thought patterns. When there's consistent thought pattern, And people come up with wild interpretations or improper translations, which we've seen. They tend to try to shoot holes in things. But when there's a consistent flow pattern of information, and it's all in the same stream of consciousness, it's all comes from the mind of God, from the mouth of Messiah, we begin to see that there are patterns that exist. And those patterns, for me anyway, are proof in the pudding of one unity and oneness of the Word. So let's look in Mark for a moment in chapter 7, and we'll look at verses 20 to 23. And this is the Messiah speaking. And he said, "That which comes out of a man is that which defiles the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceeds evil thoughts," and again, adulteries, fornications, murder, theft, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things come from within us. They're inside us. How did they get there? What does that mean in the grand scheme of what we're here for? The Messiah came not to save us from Satan. And by the way, Satan as a name of a particular character is never used in Scripture. And in fact, there's a place that I'm going to read to you in Numbers where it's called a Satan, as in an indefinite article, which means there are more than one. Because Satan means the enemy, literally means enemy, ha-satan, enemy, accuser, prosecutor. We've spoken before about how our conscience are a part of our soul. Our soul is our conscience, our psyche, our intellect, our emotions, all right? That's our soul. That's not our spirit. But our conscience is at war with just about everything these days. We don't know what to think, what to believe, how to proceed, what's going on, what's not going on, because many folks lack that third piece, the power of the Spirit that completes us. Remember, we studied the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Lord our God is one. And you, man, shall worship the Lord with all your heart, with all your mind, and all your strength. With all your heart, your body, with all your mind, your soul, and your might and your strength. That's your spirit. That's the awakened spirit. People get so confused and corny with this whole thing about born again. But those are the words out of the Messiah himself. How can we negate or make fun of what he said? He was teaching Nicodemus, who was a priest and a Pharisee, and he said, you must be born of water and the Spirit. So Nicodemus is playing like, okay, what am I supposed to do? Go back in my mother's womb? He says, no, listen. You must be born of water naturally, but you must be born of the Spirit. That Spirit is an awakened understanding and acceptance of the sacrifice of the Messiah, the grace that we were given. That's the salvation. Yeshua, God's salvation, Christos, Hamashiach, the Messiah, the anointed Messiah, is God's salvation. That's what the name Jesus Christ means in Hebrew. So when we wrestle within ourselves, like Jacob wrestled with the angel of the Lord, that's different. But we have to wrestle with ourselves to get to that point, to wrestle with God. The old Flip Wilson show, when he did Geraldine Jones, and he'd say, the devil made me do it. Well, you know what? Ain't gonna be no Geraldine Jones, Flip Wilson stuff when you meet up with your maker. You can't fool what's with you and sees everything and hears everything and knows everything that we do. Devil don't make you do nothing. You do. I do. We make the conscious decisions on what we're going to do, say, think, not do, say, not do, all of that. That's on us. That's why I say the struggle, even when you're born again and the Spirit comes to life, it doesn't mean we're not going to sin or struggle. There are going to be those things. That's why we talked about the 3 levels of sin. Over many times we've spoken about it. The corporate sin that we explain, the commandments that are mentioned right here. All right, the sin of things done not out of faith. Faith, there's only one faith. So if you have that faith, you're already a believer in the Messiah. Doesn't mean we're not going to sin. We are. And then the ones of conscience. To him that knows to do a thing, but doeth it not, to him it is sin, or her. That's the personal relationship. That's where the conscience gets seared. That's where the debate and the struggle is between what's good in us, that spirit, and what's not so good. And we're going to learn about that. Okay, now let's take it to where we are started from. We're going to go to the book of Isaiah, chapter 14. And we're going to find out there's some very, very, not only interesting, but poignant points that need to be addressed and understood here. All right, so we're going to take our time. We're going to read through, and I'm going to be constantly checking the time because I get carried away here and I forget to look at the time. So chapter 14, verse 1, it says, "For the Lord will have mercy, chesed, on Jacob." Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, which means he shall be the Prince of God. "And he will yet choose Israel and set them in their own land." That's how long ago these prophecies were. "And the strangers shall be joined with them. And listen, they shall cleave to the house of Jacob." Cleave means to join, to be engrafted in. We've heard that in the New Covenant. To be part of, to be one with. Cleave, hold on. Okay? That's what that means. And it's very important. And it says, "The people shall take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel shall possess them in the land of the Lord for servants and handmaids. And they shall take them captives, whose captives they were, and rule over their oppressors." These are the people that continually oppressed Israel. We know that it went on then, and it's going on today, and it will continue. We spoke about the nations, and we're going to get really into some of that as we move forward out of 14 and move through this. But it says, "And it shall come to pass in the day that the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow and thy fear, and from the hard bondage wherein you were made to serve." All right? "Thou shalt take up his proverb against the king of Babylon." Remember, Babylon means confusion, and it was a place where Israel was put in bondage. "And you're going to say, How hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city has ceased. The Lord broke the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. He smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke. He ruled the nations in anger, is persecuted, and none hinders." So he goes on to talk in the next several verses about basically the hell that these people went through and what's coming on the thrones of all the kings of the nations. He says, "He's raised up, and hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming." This is in Isaiah. It's written in, goodness gracious, what's the year Isaiah was written in? Let me check real quickly, okay? About 750 years before the Messiah, all right? 750 years. And he says it plain and simple. He's coming, all right? He's going to stir up the dead for you, even the chief ones of the earth. He's going to raise up their thrones, all the kings of the nations. And they're going to speak and say unto you, Art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? But their pomp is going to be brought down. Listen, is broken down to the grave, and the noise of thy vials. The worm is spread under the tree, and the worms cover you. Now he speaks about worms. Speaks about worms. So here's something that's going to be, I think, very illuminating. I did a very detailed study on worms, and I hate worms. I don't like worms. The word worm in Hebrew and in many, many ancient cultures is the word for serpent. It is also the word for dragon. And it also means a parasite. So if the serpent and the dragon and the snake are all a worm, and a worm is a parasite, parasites don't live outside of us, they live inside of us. You know why? Because the worm is in us. That's that bit of Satan, the enemy, that is in us. We just read, the heart of man is wicked, desperately evil. Worms. We have a parasite. We have a God seed in us, but we also have this evil nature. That's the struggle. The struggle is within ourselves. The enemy is us. But there are many enemies. Many, many enemies in the spirit world. Many enemies everywhere. Anything that is an oppressor, a liar, a persecutor, a prosecutor, and the enemy is a Satan. In Numbers chapter 22, verses 22 through 35, I want to read that to you. Numbers chapter 22. Right here, and verses 22 through 35. Listen to this. And God's anger was kindled because he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the way for an adversary against him. Adversary. Satan. Now he was riding upon his ass, and his two servants were with him. And the ass saw that the angel of the Lord standing in the way, and his sword drawn in his hand, and he was turned aside out of the way, and went unto the field. And Balaam smote the ass to turn her into the way, get her back on the road. But the angel of the Lord stood in the path of the vineyards, a wall being on this side and on that side. And when the ass saw the angel of the Lord, she thrust herself unto the wall, and crushed Balaam's foot against the wall, and he smote her again. The angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place. There was no way to turn either to the left or the right. And when the ass saw the angel of the Lord, she fell down under Balaam, and Balaam's anger was kindled, and he smote the ass with a staff. And it just goes on and on until right out of the mouth, this is the part where, Balaam's ass speaks up. Okay? But that's not the point of what we're really looking for here. What we're seeing here in verse 32, the angel of the Lord said unto him, Wherefore hast thou smitten thine ass 3 times? Behold, I went out to withstand thee, because you are in a perverse way before me. Okay? You have done this. And he speaks again about the heart of man. That it's very difficult to get through. But Satan, again, the accuser, an adversary, the enemy. All right? Now, let's talk about some research that I've also done with respect to worms and serpents and the like. Okay? And we're going to go back to Isaiah 14 shortly, but we need to get through some of this first. So, after doing the research, I started to think about, could this serpent in the Garden of Eden be this worm? Is there a connection to worms? And truthfully, I went a looking and a digging, and it didn't take long, because as I said, the word for serpent, snake, and dragon is worm, which is a parasite. Now, let's talk about the Garden of Eden. Eden is commonly pronounced by all to be at the basic delta, the fertile crescent of the Tigris-Euphrates River, which is in Iraq, 75 miles from Babylon. Iraq became Persia. And the coastal plain that exists and surrounds all of that area of the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley has a bunch of deciduous forests. Now, that area was once plush and beautiful, and I'll tell you why. Because that's where it is commonly known and taught that is where the Garden of Eden was. Okay? We can read that in Genesis as well. And the place is called Querna, Q-U-E-R-N-A, Querna. So this area that was lush and plush and beautiful then, not so much now, more desert. In any event, I wanted to find out what worms were indigenous to that area. And that area is also surrounded, as I said, by what's called cypress swamps. You have the Tigris, the rivers, then you have the cypress swamps, and then back further are the deciduous forests. And they're all on the coastal plain. Well, guess what? The place that they say was now is Eden, which is now Querna, as I said, is surrounded by these cypress swamps in its entirety. That whole area of that Fertile Crescent where the Tigris and the Euphrates are surrounded by cypress swamps. Okay? Well, guess what? There's an animal that's indigenous to two places on Earth, the Americas, mostly South America, and Iraq, at the Fertile Crescent, Eden. The serpent is called a worm snake. It's about 3 inches long. It's parasitical. It can't hurt you physically, but one has to wonder, really, if this worm snake, which is indigenous, almost its whole population lives right in that same spot where Eden was. And God said, for the rest of your life, you'll be condemned to crawling on the ground. He didn't say you'd be able to climb trees like regular snakes and other snakes, tree snakes, etc. He said this one has no capacity, no capability to climb a tree. And you say, well, okay. Well, what does that mean? And don't forget, parasites don't exist outside the body. The host, in this case, like any other virus, parasite is us. We're the host. Okay? So we're coming up on about another minute before our break. But I want to get back to, and it's going to be very interesting when we continue on our study. I'll repeat the last scripture that we read in Isaiah, and then the very next one after that will be very enlightening as we proceed into the more difficult and things needing exposition in the rest of this chapter. So get ready for a break. Take a couple minutes break. Lighten up a little bit. Crack that neck. Get ready, because we're going to hit it hard when we get back, okay? All right. We'll be off the air in about 15, 20 seconds, and then we'll be back short after our short break. Okay. See you in a few.